recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Kinzinger, for however long he chooses.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to my colleagues on the committee. Thank you to our witnesses. I never expected today to be quite as emotional for me as it has been. I've talked to a number of you and gotten to know you. I think it's important to tell you right now, though, you guys may individually feel a little broken. You guys all talk about the effects you have to deal with, and you talk about the impact of that day. But you guys won. You guys held. Democracies are not defined by our bad days. We're defined by how we come back from bad days, how we take accountability for that. And for all the overheated rhetoric surrounding this committee, our mission is very simple. It's to find the truth, and it's to ensure accountability. Like most Americans, I'm frustrated that 6 months after a deadly insurrection breached the United States Capitol for several hours on live television, we still don't know exactly what happened. Why? Because many in my party have treated this as just another partisan fight. It's toxic, and it's a disservice to the officers and their families, to the staff and the employees on the Capitol complex, to the American people who deserve the truth, and to those generations before us who went to war to defend self-governance, because self-governance is at stake. And it's why I agreed to serve on this committee. I want to know what happened that day, but more importantly, I want all Americans to be able to trust the work this committee does and get the facts out there free of conspiracy. This cannot continue to be a partisan fight. I'm a Republican, I'm a conservative. But in order to heal from the damage caused that day, we need to call out the facts. It's time to stop the outrage and the conspiracies that fuel the violence and division in this country, and most importantly, we need to reject those that promote it. As a country, it's time to learn from our past mistakes, rebuild stronger so this never happens again, and then we can move onward. And serving on this committee, I'm here to investigate January 6th, not in spite of my membership in the Republican Party, but because of it. Not to win a political fight, but to learn the facts and defend our democracy. Here's what we know. Congress was not prepared on January 6th. We weren't prepared because we never imagined that this could happen. An attack by our own people, fostered and encouraged by those granted power through the very system they sought to overturn. That is a lesson. That is not a conspiracy theory or a counter-narrative. We don't blame victims. We go after the criminals. Some have concocted a counter-narrative to discredit this process on the grounds that we didn't launch a similar investigation into the urban riots and looting last summer. Mr. Chairman, I was called on to serve during the summer riots as an Air National Guardsman. I condemn those riots and the destruction of property that resulted. But not once did I ever feel that the future of self-governance was threatened like I did on January 6th. There is a difference between breaking the law and rejecting the rule of law, between a crime, even grave crimes, and a coup. As we begin our work today, I want to call this committee's attention to the oath of office, an oath not to a party, not to an individual, but to the Constitution that represents all Americans. Everyone in elected office knows how hard it can be sometimes to keep that oath, to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States in the forefront of our minds, what with the political pressures and re-elections always around the corner. But Mr. Chairman, our witnesses today, like every law enforcement officer across the country, took the same oath we did. And on January 6th, the temptation to compromise their oaths didn't come in the form of a campaign check or a threat from leadership or an all-caps tweet. It came in the form of a violent mob. While we on this dais were whisked away from the danger, heroes like those here stood their post before it and paid the price. And we are only here now because you guys were here then. Therefore, it's altogether fitting that we begin our investigation of January's lawless attack against the Constitution with these 4 men who made sure that the attack did not succeed, with those who helped to ensure that democracy held. And I think it's important to remember that you are 4 with stories, but there are hundreds with stories as well that you represent where you sit. Officer Fanone, I know your passion is to make sure that DC Metro gets the credit it's due. And I thank you for I know that you represent the hundreds of officers like Officer Hodges that responded to that call. What I want to ask, does this feel like old history to any of the 4 of you? Sometimes I get, we hear out there, it's time to move on, right? It's been 6 whole months, time to move on. Does this feel like old history and time to move on? You can just say yes or no.
No, sir.
Nope.
There can be no moving on without accountability. There can be no healing until we make sure this can't happen again.
I echo that. How do you move on without correcting what happened?
Let me ask you all, one of the narratives out there, and Officer Fanone, it triggered something in your testimony when you said it. So there's been this idea that this was not an armed insurrection, and as if somehow that is justification for what happened. We know the hugs and kisses. We know it was BLM and Antifa, right? Of course, then you would, I'm sure, want to investigate that if that's the case. Now we've heard maybe the FBI actually started this, but one of the ones that has always held was that this was not an armed insurrection. Officer Dunn, you mentioned that those that stormed the Capitol were very well organized and trained, and let me ask you, and I'll ask actually to all 4 of you, and Officer Hodges, I know this was part of your job initially before you responded to the Capitol. If in the middle of all that melee, you see somebody with a gun in that crowd, would you be able to go out, apprehend, arrest them, read them their rights, and go through that process? Or was the mission at the moment survival and defense of the Capitol? So I'm asking, is it possible that people maybe had guns? And we've seen that actually there were. But this idea that, well, people weren't arrested with guns, at the time it was raw survival. We can just start on the left. Let me ask you, what's your response to that?
For those people who continue to downplay this violent attack on our democracy and our officers, I suggest them to look at the videos and the footage right now, because common things were used as weapons, like a baseball bat, a hockey stick, a rebar, a flagpole, including the American flag. Pepper spray, bear spray, so you name it. You have all these items and things that were thrown at us and used to attack us. Those are weapons. No matter if it is a pen, the way they were using these items, it was to hurt officers. It was to hurt police officers. Their intent was not to say, hey, let me go and find the Republicans or the Democrats in there or the independents. It was every single body that was here in this building, in the Capitol, that their intent was to get them out and hurt them. It would have been a much different outcome had we not stopped them, especially at the lower West Terrace entrance. Even though at that time, we didn't know that there were other breaches in the Capitol. Our intent was to stop whoever was trying to come in through that door. And those weapons that were used, those were common items. The way they were using it was as weapons.
Let me ask too, in kind of my final moments. Sergeant Cannell, Officer Hodges, you were Virginia Guardsman, I believe, fellow Guardsman.
Yes, sir.
At any time in your service in the military, as you know, I'm an Air Guardsman. And Sergeant Cannell, you specifically mentioned your time in Iraq. At any time in your military service, did you change how you defended the person to your left or right, or how you trained with them based on their political affiliation?
No, not
Whether
at all.
it was in war or anything?
No.
No, sir. The way I view it at that time, it was I'm an American, and the person right next to me is an American, and I would do everything possibly for me to defend him and the country at that time.
You guys did that? You guys did that in the blue.
Yes, sir.
And I want to say that is the mission of this committee. We may have our deep differences on other policy issues, but we are all Americans today. And we thank you for holding that line.
Congressman, if I may respond to Congressman, when you asked about the armed part, when the assumed officers showed me their what appeared to be a police badge, I don't know too many police officers, and this is just me being a police officer for 13 years, that carry their badge and don't carry a gun with them. So we look on their hips, you see a print. I didn't see that it was a gun, but a reasonable police officer will believe that that's a gun on their hip. So.
And just to quickly be specific, a print is basically what looks like the outline of a gun.
That's correct.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, witnesses.
Thank you, gentlemen. You're a gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Kinzinger, an Iraq and Afghanistan Air Force veteran, and a lieutenant colonel in the Air National Guard.
Gentleman's recognized for 3 minutes.
Well, I thank the chairman for yielding. Let me just say first, Madam Speaker, as a Republican, don't let my side use the security posture as the straw man argument in this. The reality is that's the equivalent of blaming the victim of a crime for the crime. And while it is important, that's not what we're here to talk about today. Madam Speaker, voting on a criminal contempt resolution is not the position we hoped to be in, but Steve Bannon went out of his way to earn this resolution before us, and now we must approve it. Mr. Bannon's willful disregard for the Select Committee's subpoena demonstrates his utter contempt for the American people's right to know how the attacks on January 6 came about. He has advanced a ludicrous legal argument in support of his decision not to cooperate or comply, a decision that defies the rule of law and rejects the will of the American people. Mr. Bannon's reported actions put him near the center of the investigation into the events surrounding January 6th. His own words strongly suggest that the actions of the mob that stormed the Capitol and invaded this very chamber came as no surprise to him. He and a few others were, by all accounts, involved in planning that day's events and encouraged by those who attacked the Capitol, our officers, and our democracy. I have no doubt that Mr. Bannon's scorn for our subpoena is real, but no one, and I repeat, no one, is above the law, and we need to hear from him. As the Select Committee's contempt report states, it was Mr. Bannon who on January 5th predicted with chilling accuracy, quote, "All hell is going to break loose tomorrow." On his radio show that day, he stated, quote, "It's not going to happen like you think it's going to happen, okay? It's going to be quite extraordinarily different. All I can say is strap in. You made this happen, and tomorrow it's game day. So strap in. Let's get ready." And it was Mr. Bannon who is recorded as saying, quote, "It's all converging, and now we're on the point of attack tomorrow." Mr. Bannon said these things publicly as a private citizen, someone deeply involved with Stop the Steal movement, and he said them nearly 3 years after leaving his job at the White House. Mr. Bannon was also reportedly among the small group of Trump confidants assembled at the Willard Hotel to discuss plans to stop or delay the January 6th count. Is it any wonder that the Select Committee needs to hear from him, that we want to see related materials that he has? Furthermore, does anyone really believe Mr. Bannon's actions are covered by a blanket, no questions asked claim of executive privilege, one the former president has never actually made? Madam Speaker, Steve Bannon is a key witness to the Select Committee's probe. He has yet to say or produce anything in response to the subpoena, and his assertion of executive privilege is far-fetched in the extreme and not his to make. I urge my colleagues to join me to support the contempt resolution, and I yield back. Terry, thank you for being here and spending this time. It's very important. You know, watching some of this debate, I think it's important to remind people, yes, the Trump administration failed in the setup, And I think the Biden administration absolutely failed in the execution of this. I also want to make it clear, Mr. Secretary, we support the members of the State Department and their heroic action in the evacuation. I think the broader point is they never should have been put in a place where they had to act heroically. We found ourselves many times, we talk about Bagram and leaving that, and I think that's important to point out. But there was also moments where the U.S. military, with the 6,000 people that we sent in, could have defended Kabul proper. It was clear that the Taliban were not intending to move into Kabul as early as they did. But we put them in a position where they had to act heroically. And we shouldn't ask that of our State Department employees, even though we appreciate that they did. I also think it's important to point out, there's a lot of blame of the Afghan military. And I certainly, as a military man myself, wish that the Afghan military would have helped. But keep in mind, prior to that, there were assessments coming out that it was only a matter of time. Maybe it's 6 months, maybe it's a year, until the whole place collapsed. We had built a military in our own image that relied on air power, that relied on logistics. And then we pulled our logistic and air power support from the Afghan military. And as they received night letters from the Taliban saying, we're going to kill your family because the United States is vacating, they're leaving you. It's, to me, as much as I would love for them to have stayed and taken a stand heroically, I don't know many even of our allies' militaries that frankly could have stood in those conditions in that kind of an onslaught. Let me ask you, though, Mr. Secretary, you talk a little about the Taliban legitimacy, and we're going to see how they act. I want to ask you a question, because I'm not sure where that changed. At the beginning of all of this, we were talking about building a worldwide coalition to not recognize the Taliban. And all of a sudden, this is on the table. Is the Taliban the legitimate government of Afghanistan? And if not, would you consider what the Taliban have done in Afghanistan to be a coup d'etat?
First, let me just start by thanking you for your strong words in support of the men and women of the State Department. I very much appreciate them and appreciate you saying them. Second, with regard to the Taliban and your question, it is the de facto government of Afghanistan. Those are just the facts. And
I don't mean to interrupt, but I need to. Has there been any discussion of an Afghan government in exile, vice president, even if the president had left? Is there any discussion of that? Because this, to me, appears to be an armed military coup against the legitimate elected government of Afghanistan.
Congressman, I will certainly look to see what the lawyers say. From where I sit, this is the product, alas, of one side getting the upper hand in a civil war.
Let me ask a couple of questions here on something too about that. So if we look at the list of new key players in the regime, we have the current prime minister who was deputy during the 9/11 attacks, the current deputy prime minister who served as number 2 defense official during the 9/11 attacks, the current foreign minister who's your counterpart was the Minister of Culture and Information during the 9/11 attacks. And we have designated terrorists in key positions like those that are responsible for preventing Afghanistan from becoming a safe haven and terror once again. So we look at that list and we see those individuals who not only defended al-Qaeda, but have committed crimes against women and vulnerable populations. And I think anybody would look at that and say, this is the same regime that failed to hand over Osama bin Laden 20 years ago. But let me just ask you, have these individuals committed to denouncing al-Qaeda, to denouncing the Haqqani network, and ensuring that they will execute any attacks against them should they try to organize in their territory?
Well, in the agreement that was secured by the previous administration, the Taliban, now represented by these individuals, made commitments not to allow Afghanistan to be used as a launching ground for externally directed terrorism, whether by al-Qaeda or by anyone else. The big question now, and you're right to point to it, is whether they will make good on that commitment. But of course, we can't and won't rely on them to do that, even as we insist that they do.
Let me ask you too. Thank you, and I'm sorry to cut you off. Just
no, please go ahead.
Points. Number one, we absolutely have to be executing any attack against al-Qaeda that we can, where we see them form. And secondarily, because I'm running out of time, let me stress to you the importance of State Department working hand in hand in a public and private way with these NGOs made up of former veterans that are doing stuff that unfortunately the government can no longer do. And let me encourage you to give them top cover and work with them to provide the assets necessary to get these people out. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I yield back.
Let me just say, I really appreciate you saying that and putting the spotlight on that, because veterans groups are doing remarkable work. We're in close contact with them. I met with about 75 veterans organizations and groups virtually about a week ago. We followed up with a number of other meetings, and we deeply appreciate the work that many veterans on this committee, as well as organizations, are doing. And we're looking to work even more closely together on that. Thank you.
Good news.